Well, good morning. And on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, welcome. Thank you for joining us today for what we expect will be a very interesting conversation with Mr. Eliot Higgins about Bellingcat, and specifically about We Are Bellingcat, Global Crime, Online Sleuths, and the Bold Future of News. We are on the record today, and we will have an opportunity for our audience to pose questions. So please, as they occur to you, go ahead and enter them using the Q&A box, and we're going to get to them as many as we can, roughly in the order that they come in. Eliot, we're glad to have you, and thank you for doing this. I want to highlight for our participants today a review of your book that was written by CSPC's own Joshua Huminski, which I think is quite a good description of some of both the investigative issues that you talk about in the book, sort of how you did these things and what you learned, as well as a description of your approach to open source reporting and some of the things that reveal about our societies and indeed about the way the world digests information in this technological age. I think we're still coming to terms as societies with how we understand, educate, share information, communicate with each other. And CSPC has been deeply involved over the last few years in a program of studying great powers competition, looking for ways to promote American national security and that of our close friends and allies. And a big part of that conversation has revolved around our competition with authoritarian systems, not just trying to get military and maintain military supremacy with our adversaries, but competing for a narrative with authoritarian countries who take extreme measures to try to control information. A challenge for them these days, as you know better than anybody, is it's harder, I think, in some ways, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this. It's harder and harder to control some aspects of information with the internet. There's just a lot out there. On the other hand, the volume is almost so large and so undirected that it can be difficult for the well-intentioned consumer of news to make heads or tails and understand who to trust, what sources to trust, and how to really evaluate all the information that is there. I just want to mention briefly, I did spend some time prior to my time in government, before I came to head CSPC, working in the technology field, and for a company that does data analysis and builds platforms to try to understand information from different sources. And one of the things we found that I learned there was processing structured information is challenging, but very doable. Processing unstructured information, tweets and just written news reports is also doable, but in many ways much more challenging, and requires the human analyst to put context on, to really help people understand. And so I'm excited to have you here to talk about your process and what you're able to do with largely open source information, and perhaps share with us your perspective on some of the challenges given the volume of information. So I guess it's kind of in some ways a good news, bad news story. But we're excited to have you because the experience you've had, I think, will help for us shed light on how we ought to think about this modern technological information bonanza and challenge, and how we can better understand our world and in some ways influence more nefarious actors to accept a larger degree of transparency on their actions. So with that, let me just say again, thank you, Eliot. I'll turn it over to you to talk about your organization, your book, your process, and maybe you can just tell us kind of where this all started, and then we'll come back and have some questions at the end. So thanks, Eliot. Go ahead.
So I am not from a professional background in any kind of sense of the word. Back in 2010, 2011, I was kind of working kind of normal admin jobs for various companies. I didn't have any experience as an investigator, but I did have a keen interest in what was happening at that point in the Arab Spring countries. In particular, as someone who spent a lot of time on the internet, I was spent a lot of time watching the kind of video footage coming from, for example, Egypt, when there was the kind of Battle of Tahrir Square that was being live streamed. The that kind of first drew me into understanding there was this kind of content coming from these online sources that could show a perspective that you normally didn't see, because usually you're relying on journalists on the ground, for example, to report what was happening. But now I realized there were so many different sources of information, and as just like a kind of normal user of the internet, I wanted to kind of find out more about what was happening. And suddenly there was all these different sources, but alongside that there was this kind of debate over what was authentic and what wasn't, and that was happening both in the kind of media and other kind of professional organizations, but also in the kind of comment sections where I would kind of hang out and argue with people about what was happening. And I was very frustrated that I could see lots of videos, kind of information coming from places like Libya, for example, that seemed to have really precise details about certain things that were happening, like where frontline positions were, where towns that had been captured, but no one was really taking them seriously. And the reason that was because people felt they couldn't verify them, and the media was worried that that they couldn't trust this stuff, ever since they had kind of scandals around things like the gay girl in Damascus blog, which a lot of the media were citing and turned out to be a white guy in America. And that kind of experience, I think, scared them off. Also, the people online who were really using these videos were conspiracy theorists. They spot some white guy in a video from Libya and decide he was a CIA officer directing the rebels, and proved all their theories right. So I didn't want to become one of these people who was giving my opinion on what I was seeing in these videos without actually having an evidence reason for doing that, because I was just like some random person on the internet, so why would anyone listen to me anyway? So in a way, that kind of informed the process that I began to develop as an amateur of analyzing this kind of material. I discovered you could use satellite imagery and compare it to what was visible in the videos and photographs, and use this thing we can now call geolocation. And around that, this kind of small community of people who were figuring out the same stuff and were interested in what was happening in these Arab Spring countries, from media organizations, from human rights organizations and elsewhere, started forming this small community online, and literally probably a dozen people. But that was kind of the birth of the kind of online open source investigation movement that became so much of what is the root of what we have today. So I decided to start a blog just almost as a hobby and write up about this stuff. And I gathered a kind of following of people, journalists and arms experts, and people who were just interested in what I was finding in these videos. And that included things like the first videos of cluster bombs from Syria, the first videos of barrel bombs, and learning what weapons the opposition groups had. And over time, I built up a knowledge of those weapons by basically systematically watching these videos coming from the conflict in Syria, and then asking myself the question, can I figure out what these weapons are that they have in these videos, what these bomb debris are, that are coming out? And because most of them are Soviet era weaponry, and there's a huge community online of people who are basically Soviet era weaponry nerds who have like the text on every single bolt and scrap of material that you can imagine logged somewhere, you can actually start piecing together what these things actually were. So that's what I started to do. I kind of trained myself in a way to do this by every day looking for something new and interesting in these videos. And by 2013, I had been doing it for a year. And at the start of a year, I saw these weapons turning up in videos that I had never seen before. And this is still when it was just me and my blog and, a few hundred people reading it every day. But there I discovered that there were new weapons coming into the country that were from the former Yugoslavia. They'd never been seen in the conflict before. And at that point, I knew a journalist, CJ Chivers at the New York Times, who I took that story to, and he looked into it, and using that content I had discovered, took it to policymakers, who basically admitted there was a secret operation to arm the rebels in the south of the country, which the Saudis were flying weapons over, putting them through Jordan and smuggling them to the rebel groups. And that was revealed because they were posting them on YouTube when they got them and showing them off and using them in fighting that they were filming and sharing. But at that point, I was one of the few people who publicly were kind of looking through those videos and writing about it. So I ended up getting this kind of scoop that kind of brought me to the attention of the kind of world's media. I was still kind of working in my normal day job and doing this as a hobby. And all of a sudden I had the likes of kind of CNN filming me at home, calling me a stay-at-home Mr. Mom who's discovering weapons in Syria, and all these kind of weird interviews, and that kind of boosted my profile. But it was really the August 21st, 2013 sound attacks where I think a lot of people really got to know my work who were kind of really focused on the conflict in Syria, because that was a huge story. But I was still one of the only people who had been using these open source videos in a systematic fashion. So when the video started appearing online of the munitions that were used, I think I was the only person who recognized them from previous chemical attacks. One that actually happened only a few weeks earlier in another part of Damascus, but had gone completely unnoticed because it wasn't, they weren't loads of videos on YouTube about it for the media to pick up on. So that kind of then really brought me more and more to the attention of human rights kind of people, journalists, even policymakers. But it also put me into conflict with some kind of more traditional journalists. So, for example, Seymour Hersh wrote an article for the London Review of Books where he was basically using a source who claimed these weapons were coming from Turkey and being provided by jihadists to basically do a false flag attack. And I could see from the evidence through open sources that couldn't possibly be true, not least because the weapons had been used by the Syrian government forces before anyway. So, they weren't unique. And just the amount of sarin that would have been needed to be used would have been vast and way beyond the capabilities of kind of jihadis manufacturing it in bathtubs, which Seymour Hersh seemed to think is how you make sarin. So that then kind of had this argument of people saying, well, this is kind of new journalism with, the internet stuff versus old journalism. But I never really saw what I was doing in that context. It was a kind of investigative technique that could combine with more traditional forms of reporting, but also other kinds of fields of investigations, around human rights and other issues. That then took me to 2014, where I had then been kind of blogging for 2 years, and there was a growing interest in what I was doing and open source investigation in general, and using these new online sources. So I decided to do a Kickstarter campaign to crowdfund a new website. I raised about $80,000 and launched a website called Bellingcat on July 14th, 2014. And that's when 3 days later, Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine. And that became a huge catalyst, not just for Bellingcat, but also the entire online open source community, because previously it had been very much focused on Syria, and the way open source evidence was coming from there was usually through media centers, armed groups. It was in a very limited way, but with Ukraine, you basically had the entire internet, and everyone started digging through it, trying to discover what the truth was behind these photographs that they were discovering online and all this other information that they were finding. So for that moment, it was really huge for the whole field, because very quickly on Twitter and social media, people kind of formed these informal communities of investigators. But Bellingcat was really the only place where there were people who already had been kind of doing open source investigation, mainly kind of me and this really small community. But those people had kind of seen what I'd been doing, learned how to do things like geolocation, and like came to me when they said, oh, I've got this geolocation of this book missile launcher that's being filmed in Ukraine. And we formed a kind of informal investigation community, which we then called the Bellingcat Investigation Team after the Slack channel that we created for it. And started discovering things about the route of the missile launcher through eastern Ukraine, the fact that it had gone to this launch site, and even the joint investigation team reached out to me and interviewed me as a witness and asked me to explain what we had done to them. And that seems to have triggered them moving more into using kind of open source evidence. Then over the years, Bellingcat kind of doubled in size every year. I started hiring staff members. We worked on a broader range of subjects. Some of that included, more recently, the investigation into the poisoning of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury. That then led us to an investigation that found more activities of this GRU unit, Unit 29155, including an earlier poisoning in Bulgaria. That then also led us to discovering that these poisoners had been calling up people at a chemical weapons lab that was basically hidden in Russia, and they seemed to be the people providing these poisonings. So when Navalny was poisoned, we, using basically information you can buy in Russia quite freely, got hit the phone records of these scientists who we knew had been talking to the previous poisoning teams, and discovered they'd been talking to an FSB team. We looked into their records, travel records and phone records, and discovered they'd actually been following Navalny on nearly 40 separate trips, including the one where he was poisoned. We then worked with Navalny's team to investigate this, and that ended up with Navalny calling up more of the poisoning team and tricking him into giving a 50-minute confession of exactly what happened, including exactly where the poison was applied, which was in the inner seam of his underpants. So that was quite a big moment, as you can imagine, both for us and Navalny. But then that actually led on to more investigations where we've discovered there's kind of more of these kind of FSB teams and or more people being followed by this FSB team. You know, 3 successful assassinations, it seems. A major Russian opposition figure, Vladimir Kara-Murza, he was also poisoned twice in 2015 and 2017 after being followed by this same team. And there's more we have to publish on that. But now Bellingcat has grown so much. We're now we've gone from kind of my blog to now we're a foundation in the Netherlands. We have 20 staff members. We're run as a charity, so a non-profit. We're also working on developing like a production company so we can turn our stuff into documentaries, but also we're moving more and more into working on issues around justice and accountability, because there is a question about how this information can be used as evidence in places like the International Criminal Court and for other legal cases. And that's something we've been working on for, since about 2016, developing processes around investigations using open source evidence, because this kind of entire field really formed out of amateurs, we've ended up in a position where we're the ones who kind of have to figure out how to use this evidence, because those larger kind of more bureaucratic organizations, it took them a long time to realize that this is something that could be important to their work, and they didn't have their own internal expertise. And those who did develop those expertise were basically people who started doing it off as a hobby, and they managed to turn it into their careers, such as myself. So now we find ourselves in this position where, we're working, with lawyers and judges to look at how this kind of evidence can be used in court for legal proceedings and whether it actually can. So that's kind of a summary of what we're doing at Bellingcat at the moment.
Can I ask you, and I do want to invite our audience again, please go ahead and submit any questions you have for Eliot using the Q&A function. But let me ask you to talk a little more about that sort of question of trust and the development of these investigative techniques. It's not just about the technique and your personal confidence in the validity of the information that you're able to vet through your process, but it's very much about, as you suggested, both being able to convince either a public or an institutional observer or user of your reporting that there's validity there that's comparable to what they would have expected and from a journalist around whom they'd build a sense of trust over time, using perhaps, as you suggested, kind of just traditional reporting methods. And you mentioned yours is kind of a blending of both traditional and some new things. But the newness is all this information that's available open source. A lot of it is just provided by individuals, some of whom may be known, many of whom are not. The volume is great, and it's a big challenge for you and your team to go through that. So I'm interested if you can comment on how you feel the process of developing trust in your process and findings has gone. And then maybe I can ask you if you might share an anecdote where in a particular investigation you were particularly surprised by what you were able to find through just open source information that that was actually just available for whoever was willing to do the work to go find it.
Well, when I first started doing this, I was just kind of, a nobody with a blog. So I knew that the only way anyone would really listen to me is if I could be transparent about my sources and how I was coming to my conclusions. And, when I started off, I was doing quite simple stuff like geolocating stuff and writing the process of geolocation and sharing the YouTube links. And then, cluster bomb might show up that no one had seen in Syria before. And then I'd find kind of all the, links to the videos showing these cluster bombs, showing the, links to the various kind of arms weapons and kind of websites and linking it all together. So it's always about being very transparent about the evidence and the actual process. And as I kind of gained experience, I could make this kind of more complicated. And as we moved then into kind of the Bellingcat period in 2014 onwards, very early on, we were still basically a bunch of volunteers who had no kind of intention that anything we would be doing would be turned into anything more than like a post on the website. But when we started discovering that there were legal cases, people were coming to us, like the European Court of Human Rights case on MH17, asking us to submit our work as evidence, we had to look at that process and review it. So, and as we kind of got better at doing open source investigations, these investigations were becoming increasingly complicated. And a good example of that with MH17 is when we first started off doing that investigation as like a group of volunteers, the first thing we looked at were 5 or 6 videos and photographs that were being shared online, showing a Buk missile launcher. Some of them we didn't know the original source for, they just kind of appeared online and then kind of just been shared everywhere, making it impossible to find the original source. But one, for example, was a photograph of the missile launcher on the back of a low loader driving through a town past a gas station. And it was claimed to be in a town in eastern Ukraine, but there wasn't that many clues. But one of the colleagues I work with, Alec Torra, he noticed there was a shop sign, and he Googled the shop sign and the town it was supposedly in, and there was no result. So then he Googled the shop sign and some other towns in the area, and there was one result for a town in a place called Torres. So he Googled searched through the results of that, and there had actually been a fight in that same shop in that town. And the court document where there'd been that fight had a full address for it. So we searched for that full address, which had the street name in it. And what popped up then was not only the address on kind of Google Maps, but also videos people have been sharing online of themselves driving around the streets of Ukraine, filming it on their dashboard camera, and then uploading it up on YouTube as a kind of hobby, where they would list all the streets they had just driven down. Not like exciting streets, like just normal town streets, but one of them was this place with the gas station. So we could then use that video. It was so long that we could map the whole thing out on a Google satellite imagery and show exactly the moment when it passed the same gas station. And then what actually happened there was journalists on the ground who saw our work went out there and took photographs of the location, spoke to the local people to confirm they had seen the missile launcher, and could show in the photographs it was the same place. But that was just kind of the basic start of what we did with that. Later on, we discovered that the missile launcher had been in a convoy that had traveled through Russia towards the Ukrainian border a few weeks earlier. We could match details and damage on the side of the missile launcher on July 17th to this missile launcher in this convoy, of which there were many missile launchers, but this was one that had multiple perfect matches. So there we went to, we knew it had originated the convoy from Kursk, where there was the 53rd Air Defense Brigade, and they had a VKontakte profile, so kind of Russia's equivalent on Facebook. And all the soldiers in the brigade, or most of them, had followed this social media profile for the brigade. And we used that to basically look through the network of information. And what surprised us is we could reconstruct the entire brigade with photographs, names, ranks, lots of details about every single person in that military unit. It took about a year to piece this together, I should add, 2 people working on it. But it was all from open sources. It was all publicly available information, and it was enough to reconstruct this entire unit, the route they'd taken through Russia to Ukraine, showing that they were being told they were on an exercise to go to the border and all this other information. And that was just one example of how we could use kind of, Russian soldiers' social media to prove that they'd been fighting in the conflict with Ukraine, because they were posting that information on social media themselves. And that really took us by surprise, because you would think they would be a bit more careful about that kind of thing if they were fighting in an illegal war in another country. But no, they were just like taking selfies in front of their tanks in Ukraine, then going home with the same tank and taking the same photograph of it in Russia, which we could geolocate and match the 2 tanks and prove it was, they weren't just tourists. And that, eventually led to the Russians passing a law that made it illegal for soldiers to share social media posts in that way of their service. So, we kind of just started thinking that maybe we could figure out where some of the photographs were taken, but discovered the entire composition of a whole military brigade. So I think that's a good example of what was possible and what was so surprising.
It's interesting. I remember an example where U.S. forces were challenged with a technological development with some sort of Fitbit data being made publicly available about their movements around bases in Afghanistan that allowed for the actually quite effective mapping of the perimeter of the bases. And so it did raise this question of information that's accidentally made available. And in that case, it was something that was quite concerning security-wise. you've raised some good examples of where it's actually very helpful in terms of transparency from an investigative journalist perspective. We have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, and obviously there's quite a bit of interest given the news coverage recently about Alexei Navalny, and you raised this as one of the things you had worked on recently. I understand you were doing that investigation as the book went to print, but would you mind sharing a little more detail about how you did that investigation? I mean, it's just one of these, it's like a story you couldn't ask for someone to even make up the details of the story. It's so incredible. But can you talk a little more about how you were able to collect the information you needed to advance what we now know about that particular incident, that poisoning?
So it actually really started in 2018 with the poisoning of the Skripals, when there was information released by the UK authorities about the two suspects, so photographs and names, which wasn't enough for us to do anything with at that point. But quite quickly after those were released, a Russian news site published the flight manifest of the flight they were on when they came to the UK, which had details like their date of birth and their passport details. And my colleague, Christo Grozev, who volunteers with us and still does, he was kind of now our lead kind of Russian spy hunter, but he knew there were these leaked databases you could get from Russia, things like car registrations and house registrations. So he looked them up on the databases, and he said it's really odd because these guys are on the 2013 and onwards databases, but anything before 2012, they don't exist. So that made us really suspicious because they clearly weren't 5 years old. So there was something there. And he also knew there was this kind of Russian data market, this kind of black market for data, where you could buy all kinds of information like phone records, registration documents of anyone you like in Russia. So he decided he would buy the documents for some of these. So he looked up basically everyone with the same name and date of birth in these databases, quickly eliminated most of them as having social media profiles where you could see they clearly weren't the person. And that left him with 3 or 4 people. So he used this kind of these Russian data services, which are basically enabled by Russian corruption being so endemic that everyone's kind of trying to make a bit of money somewhere. And he got these domestic passport registration documents for them. And one of them had the exact photograph, or a photograph that matched exactly with the person who was on Russia Today saying I was a sports nutrition salesman coming to visit Salisbury for my holiday with my friend here. And his document was very weird because it had a stamp with the Russian Ministry of Defense's phone number on it, basically saying, call this number if you read this document. And the second page of the document, which was supposed to have all the details of his old passport, was blank. And it said that he had lost his previous passport. We then got the same document for the second guy, and it was exactly the same stamps, same missing information. And then we decided we'd try and see if we could figure out who these guys were, but we have their fake identities. And we had seen in a few years earlier, there'd been an attempted coup in Montenegro. And during that coup, someone had been arrested, and a suspected GRU officer who had 2 IDs. And the IDs were different for different people, but they had the same first name, same date of birth, and same place of birth. So we use that pattern to think, okay, let's look up for people who have the same first name, date of birth, and place of birth as the guys we've identified, because we've got their passport registration documents, so we've got that information. And by doing that, we were actually able to discover basically another list of people who had matching details and start narrowing them down, looking at various sources, until we were able to find one guy who was registered at the dormitory of the GRU in St. Petersburg, I think it was. So he seemed very suspicious and had the same first name, date of birth, and place of birth as this sports nutrition salesman. And we got his photographic details, and it was exactly the same guy. And we did something similar to the second guy, but that kind of taught us the methodology for outing Russian spies. We also get their phone records, and also the phone records of a third suspect that led us to another attempted assassination using a nerve agent in Bulgaria in 2015 of an arms dealer who survived. But we then looked at those phone records and discovered, basically went through line by line who they'd been calling. Now, these phone records are quite easy to get. You find the right Russian internet forum and the right person on the forum who's selling access to someone's phone records for like 500 rubles. And we would get like 2 years worth of phone records. And these records weren't just the numbers they'd been calling, but every single cell phone tower they connected to, including the coordinates of the cell phone tower, whenever they've been connecting their phone to any kind of data service, all that information. So we had a list of phone numbers, and then we went through and started identifying who the phone numbers were. Some were other GRU officers, some were the wives, some were the girlfriends, sometimes on the same phone records. And we also discovered some scientists, and these scientists were working in facilities in Russia. And we looked into them, and they were all former members of the Novichok program that was supposedly shut down. We looked into them, and that's when we discovered all these scientists who were part of this Novichok program that was shut down when Russia joined the Chemical Weapons Convention had just been moved to another facility that supposedly manufactured sports nutrition drinks, just like the suspects were selling. So we basically discovered Russia's secret nerve agent program. And then when Navalny was poisoned, we looked up those phone records again. And it was, again, just buying them off the internet. And we saw they'd been calling FSB officers. We got their phone records and their travel records and discovered that they'd been following Navalny all these different times. And so when we got to that point, we realized we had something that was quite big, and we reached out to Navalny's team, and we worked with them to, first of all, they verified all the data we had and made sure we were getting it from these sources online rather than MI6 or something like that, because they were very nervous about that. And it was such a big thing. He was amazed we had managed to figure this out, because he was thinking maybe in 30 years time, some information will leak out and I'll know that it was the FSB. We generally didn't believe it would be the FSB, because we thought it would be insane that there was like a domestic assassination program, and we had basically stumbled upon it. So then we just checked all the data, looked into, identified all the members of the team, where they'd been going, who they'd been talking to, who their bosses were, who their bosses were. And that then revealed to us that this was obviously being run from very high levels, all the way up to the Kremlin. And on the day we published, Navalny called up one of the suspects. He had called up a few suspects saying, "Hey, I'm Navalny, why did you poison me?" But they hung up immediately. But then he called up one guy, and we used a phone number spoofer. So when the guy got the call, it was coming from the FSB, he thought. He picked up, and Navalny pretended to be an assistant to a really senior FSB officer, and basically bullied him into giving a full confession by saying, "I need a report." And he was asking them for stuff like asking him for assessments of his colleagues on the operation, asking him why he thought the mission failed. And the guy just gave up everything in a 50-minute phone conversation. But we knew at that point, Putin was going to give a press conference on Friday, his yearly big press conference, and he'd probably be asked about the report. So we kept that recording secret until Putin came along and said, of course, he was being followed because, the FSB has to follow, people who are, problems for the Russian state. But if we had tried to kill him, we'd have succeeded. And we had that recording, which we then released on the following Monday, with Putin confirming that he had been followed, and now the FSB team and themselves confirming that they had tried to poison him but failed. And that just blew the whole story up even bigger than it was before. But then we started looking into the other travels of the FSB team. So we actually shared on social media the details we had of all their travels and asked people if any of them seemed to match with any mysterious deaths. That then led us to discover that we've published about this already, there were 2 Caucasus activists who had been followed by this team just before they died mysteriously, one of which was actually, the killing was investigated by the same FSB team who gave the forensic report saying he had a heart attack or something. Another one was a member of the official Russian opposition, who was the part of the official anti-corruption party in Russia, the allowed opposition. He'd been murdered as well. And then, as I said before, Vladimir Kara-Murza was another target, but we've still got at least, I think we've got 4 more people we're going to be publishing on, including major opposition figures and some surprisingly minor individuals as well. And what was shocking to us was not only there was this Russian assassination program using nerve agents, which is quite bad, but it wasn't just about going after big political figures, but people who, their only crime was being critical of Putin in a satirical way, not even as a politician. So the scope of this just seems to expand as we go. But it was only possible because Russia is just so hopelessly corrupt that, your ordinary bureaucrat is kind of selling information to people every single day, usually for people to do insurance fraud or check up on their kind of girlfriends or, wives or husbands to find out if they're behaving. But we instead use that to investigate their intelligence services.
It's just an amazing outcome. And what an amazing collection of sources you were able to put together and build, given what you found in the relatively early stages of doing that work. Let me ask you, we got some questions, something a little broader about the nature of misinformation and disinformation as a political tool, and the distinction being essentially, to my understanding, one of intent and severity, in terms of how information is created or sort of shared in a way that is more or less connected with the truth. What is your assessment of the problem of mis and disinformation as used for a political tool, and the best ways to push back against it, given what you've learned through your work?
I mean, encountered a lot of disinformation, some of which is directed at me. And we had Russian state media basically arguing I didn't really exist last week. So it's gotten to that point now where I'm being unpersoned. But for me, one thing I find very frustrating about the discussion about disinformation is it's so often portrayed as what's happening, something outside of our society being, applied to us. Russia is, doing fake news and stuff like that. There is an element of that, but I think a much more dangerous element is basically what society does to itself, and that is being fueled basically by online culture. And I think people don't recognize how the kind of online world is no longer a separate thing from kind of offline society. They've kind of almost merged completely nowadays. And that lack of recognition is quite dangerous, because I think over, probably over the last 100 years, but in particular the last, 10 or 15 years, there's been an increasing amount of, a lack of faith in traditional sources of authority, be they the government, the media, even kind of medical professionals. So if you're the sort of person who is losing your trust in kind of traditional sources of authority, you can find alternative sources of authority online. If you're saying, well, I'm not sure what's going on in Syria, I don't think we can trust the Americans after, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which there's an awful lot of people who think that, they will go online and they find websites that reinforce those ideas, that tell them, yes, you can't trust America. Syria is just a replay of what happened to Iraq. These claims of chemical weapon use, it's just like weapons of mass destruction all over again. And they get drawn more and more into these communities. And they soon find themselves kind of surrounded by this kind of alternative media ecosystem, these counterfactual communities who are telling them that you're the only person, and this community are the only people who really understand the truth of what's happening with Syria, for example. That the white helmets are jihadists that are being faking chemical attacks, that Assad is really just a misunderstood guy. And within that, you then have this kind of filtering process where within all those communities, you have people have kind of more increasingly kind of wild and conspiratorial beliefs about these, different subjects. You have people who are saying that, the chemical attacks in Syria are all being faked, every single one of them. That the, for example, on another subject, MH17, we've done a lot of work on that. There's an exactly the same community. People have sought the alternative because they don't trust the narrative that Russia's guilty, and they've convinced themselves that Ukraine is guilty. And first, it was shot down by an Su-25, and then it was a Ukrainian Buk missile launcher, and all these different theories. But they become increasingly kind of basically radicalized online. And the problem is that happens on all kinds of different subjects. We see it happening with, kind of Donald Trump, where some of these people end up, going from being just MAGA to QAnon and then attacking the Capitol building on January 6th. You have that with people thinking the earth is flat. You have people thinking, coronavirus, where they start saying, oh, I'm not sure about vaccines, and end up saying that, well, Bill Gates is putting microchips in vaccines. And, there's this form of basically online radicalization going on, and it's not really being recognized, because often we think about that in the context of Islamic radicalization online, and we aren't offering an alternative to these people. We aren't saying to these people, if you do distrust the government, and I think there's a fair reason to do that, you don't have anywhere to go but these conspiracy communities. So what, in a way Bellingcat is doing is giving an alternative of this kind of evidence-based investigations. And that's why we try to do a lot to engage with different kinds of communities at different levels. And, for me, the solution is you need to start at a kind of early age showing people how to become investigators, basically, not necessarily for them to become professional investigators in the future, but to basically empower them and show them that when they're kind of frustrated about authority and they feel betrayed by authority, as many people do nowadays, they have a way to build their own understanding of what is happening without having to go to these kind of conspiracy places. So for me, a solution would be more to engage with, there's actually an organization in the UK called Student View, where they go into schools and teach 16 to 18-year-olds to basically be part of pop-up newsrooms. and they investigate issues in their local area. You know, they're concerned about, for example, one example is in a place called Bradford. There was a small group who looked into high-speed police chases in the area, and they wanted to know why there were so many going through the kind of the poor areas of their town. And they were taught how to do freedom of information requests, and they had no idea you could do that. That was even a concept they understood that existed. And by doing that and connecting them with the local media and working with them with professional journalists, they were empowered, and they were shown how they could have an evidence-based understanding of what was happening around them, rather than being part of a group that's just angry and screaming at each other on the internet about what's wrong. And if we can do that, we then start, it's not about fighting disinformation, but you are equipping with the tools that will stop them being drawn into these communities that are creating disinformation. And these communities around things like MH17 and the chemical weapons in Syria are then used by state actors to promote their own messages. Russia, I mean, one thing that's I found really shocking about Russia and the way it uses information and disinformation is very frequently they just repeat stuff they found on the internet. Like literally, they just find conspiracy theories on the internet and then present them at a press conference and then kind of pretend it's their own information. And then they'll take kind of the personalities from these communities that start kind of appearing, and they'll have them appearing at a kind of UN panel, or they'll put them on Russia Today, or they'll promote them. But they aren't creating these communities, they're just amplifying them when they need them. And I think that's also another thing that's really lacking in recognition. So often it's seen, oh, these communities are created because Russia did this, but it's really these communities who think they're truth seekers are being amplified by those state actors who want to use them for their own good. So I think unless we start addressing that at a real kind of fundamental societal level, we'll never really be able to get a handle on it, because it'll always be about, oh, maybe we should have people having their real identities on Twitter so they, we can figure out who are the trolls and who's not, which is just to me a really poor idea, and will just push those kind of people to the edges of society more than making them part of a society that is fact-based and evidence-based.
I think thank you for raising a really interesting point there, and that is that I think we have to, when we've done a lot of research at CSBC on the lack of faith in institutions in the United States, including government institutions and the traditional media. We have in some ways allowed for an opportunity for disinformation and misinformation to exist here. And you can, as you suggested, battle back against the disinformation as hard as you want. And that's a noble goal. But if you don't repair the underlying challenge, which is that opportunity for that misinformation to circulate and find either fearful, angry, or sort of resentful ears because people have a low faith in other institutions, then you got a challenge. And so you've got to do some education of people to help prepare them for that over the long term. Let me switch gears a little bit, because we have several questions about your relationship to an assessment of the intelligence communities. A couple of things packed in here, and one is sort of how do you feel you are perceived by folks who work in the traditional intelligence communities, who have particular methodologies that your work may either enhance and assist or challenge in some way? What is your sense of your relationship with people that are in the intelligence communities? And any thoughts you can share, assessment on how well are those communities adapting to the existence of new information and the challenges of our current sort of technological reality?
I mean, I have no kind of special insight or contacts with the kind of the intelligence community, I should say, but I do hear rumors about what they think of Bellingcat. When I was first blogging, nearly 10 years ago, I did hear that I was kind of the dirty secret of some people in the intelligence community, that they would kind of read my blog and then basically just copy all the stuff from it and take all the credit away from it and say, oh, I found this video that shows this really interesting thing in Syria. So there were some people who were taking it seriously. I mean, there's more and more discussion, in the public from the intelligence community about open sources and how it's really changed, how much information is available from places all over the world that just didn't exist before. And it really is, a huge revolution in what information is available from, basically thanks to Steve Jobs and the iPhone, making everyone, have smartphones in their pocket where they're recording everything and sharing it on social media immediately. It's created basically, in a way, the iPhone and smartphones are the greatest intelligence gathering tool ever created, because people are just voluntarily sharing every single aspect of their lives. And sometimes that can include conflict. I certainly think any intelligence agency worth their salt should be taking full advantage of that, because it is, we've proven, just as a group of amateurs who've done this kind of starting off as a hobby and turned it into something more professional, that there is a massive amount of information out there, and it can give you a much finer granular understanding of what is kind of happening. And I've seen more and more actually in kind of more official reports coming from a range of different bodies, not just intelligence bodies, but places like the OPCW, for example, where they are increasingly referring to open source information, and sometimes even using it in their publications and pointing towards it, even if their primary source of information is their own investigative work on the ground. So I certainly see there's been an increase of interest in that. And bodies like the International Criminal Court, for example, I'm on the technology advisory board there, and they invited me because they saw the value of this kind of open source evidence in their own work. So I think probably more in the last 4 or 5 years, I think certainly since more MH17, I would say, than Syria, I think that acts as more of a catalyst of the value of this kind of information and what you're able to do with this. And yeah, I hope they think of me warmly in the intelligence community, because when you're exposing Russian spies, you kind of feel like you need them on your side when you're in the UK.
Absolutely. Let me pivot to another set of questions that we've gotten about your methodology and approach to standards of transparency and integrity for your team, and how do you maintain a standard across your team? And another aspect of this question has to do with technology. And one of the CSPC International Fellows was interested in your thoughts on the ethics of either artificial intelligence tools or other tools that you use to parse data. There's been a large debate about biases that can be reflected when we use machines to analyze information, especially at scale. Can you talk a little bit about how how the question of the technological ethics and the general sort of transparency and standards across you and your whole team are communicated, and anything you've learned through the process of addressing those questions?
Yeah, I mean, for the team, because we kind of almost kind of evolved as a team, we didn't have any kind of standards written down to begin with. We just kind of knew what worked. In a way, I think a lot of what really fueled our transparency in the way we do work is just understanding that there's people out there who, these counterfactual communities, who will try and challenge everything you're saying. So you have to be as transparent as possible, because they will try and pick holes in it. And more you see people like the Russian Federation using those communities to attack you. So you have to be as transparent as possible, both with the evidence and the process. And that kind of just always ingrained with the way that we are working, even when we were volunteers. But as we've kind of become a more professional organization, and we have things like editorial policies, for example, that's been a big part of it. But also the recognition that you can be too transparent when there are victims and perpetrators involved, that you can actually endanger some of these sources by sharing too much information about them, or you can re-victimize people as well. So that's something else we're very careful to be aware of when we're trying to be transparent. So we have to get the right balance with the stuff on the Russian investigations, because that wasn't kind of typical open source information. We couldn't kind of link to the databases, because they were in the Russian Federation's kind of computers. But we actually did an article explaining exactly how we went through our process and how we verified it by, if we had a point of data, we'd find 2 separate sources to verify that point of data, so there couldn't be any coordination around stuff. And that then allowed Russian journalists who actually went out and followed up our investigation and got the same data we did, using the same kind of sources, and verified that this wasn't fake data from MI6, it was real data from the Russian Federation's own computers. As for tools, things like machine learning and AI isn't really something we've used much. I mean, we kind of want to look at every single video ourselves, because there's always little details in there that you can't kind of pick up if you're an AI. But one thing that has become an increasing issue is we've been working with an organization called the Syrian Archive, where they've collected now, I think, about 3 million videos and photographs from the conflict in Syria. And the problem is a lot of this is not with any metadata whatsoever. So they need a way to have a process where they can search through this stuff very, very quickly. And they're working more with kind of machine learning tools to detect objects in these videos. Like they've been training machine learning algorithms to detect things like cluster munitions. And they've been doing that by laser scanning 3D printed models of cluster munitions, so they can train the computers to identify them. And that then allows you to kind of do triage, to kind of filter through stuff very quickly and look at those videos and start categorizing them. But we're also going to be working with them in the future. We're building this volunteer section where we'll be feeding information from their archive into our volunteer section, where people will manually geolocate and add metadata to this. And then that can be verified by kind of our team and then fed back into the archive. So it's using a kind of human network in a way to actually, add useful metadata to this rather than just always relying on computers to do it for us.
Great. Now, I appreciate that. We've got several questions that have come in for you about the notion of pushback in terms of you have some strong and resourced adversaries here. You've mentioned several governments that you've done investigations against, and you also mentioned a couple of measures they've taken to change policy or approach to try to counter the effectiveness of your work. Can you talk in a little more detail about any particular pushback that you all receive from governments or other known sources, and also adaptations that you have observed in terms of their efforts to try to minimize your ability to effectively shed light on their activities?
Yeah, really from 2015 onwards, kind of Russia was increasingly annoyed with our work. That's when we first linked the missile launcher that shot MH17 to Ukraine. To Russia rather. And first of all, it kind of started off as the kind of Russian state media started doing articles about us. Now, I can't say they were directed by the Russian state to do that, but it certainly got the attention of the sorts of people who worked there. So, Sputnik and Russia Today started doing articles about us. We were targeted by the same phishing campaign that targeted kind of the Hillary Clinton campaign, and 5,000 people were spammed with phishing emails, and we got those. We didn't actually realize it at the time because we just dismissed them as your everyday kind of phishing emails. But when all the information came out about the Podesta hack, I realized the emails that they had received had the same spelling mistakes as the emails that I had received, and four of my other colleagues said, "Oh, we had those emails as well." That then kind of the Russian Federation, officials started talking about us. In one example, the Russian Foreign Ministry said that we were using fakes, and I actually emailed their press office asking them for their evidence, and they sent one email back that was quite rude, basically saying, "No, we won't do it." I said, "Well, I just want to know what your evidence is." And I didn't think they'd reply because, why would they? I was just kind of, the guy from Bellingcat. But they then sent me like an 8-page document in Russian with 4 reasons why we had kind of faked evidence. And as we were reading through it, we realized they had plagiarized it from a guy's live journal. It wasn't their own evidence. They were just copying. And it was clearly plagiarized because they were rewording sentences to make it was like really obvious plagiarism. So we just published an article about how the Russian Foreign Ministry plagiarized their MH17 evidence. And I think that they said they'd never speak to me again when I emailed them again about that. Then the kind of Russia Today was just doing like every week there was an article about me. They sent us on to Leicester, and they ended up doorstepping my mother as part of a piece they were doing, and pretending that they couldn't find me in Leicester, even though they'd asked me in the morning if I was available, and I said no, I'm not around today. Then it started to escalate more and more. We got targeted by more phishing campaigns, one on Proton Mail that was quite sophisticated. We had more comments from the kind of Russian officials. When we published the Skripal investigation, the Russian ambassador to the UK told a room full of journalists that repeatedly that we were part of the British deep establishment and that we were working for the British intelligence services. Then we obviously, then the British counter-terrorism police came to my house and told me that I needed to now be a bit more cautious about my personal safety because of what we've been publishing. And it's just continually escalated. And now I have to be quite careful when I'm kind of staying in hotels. Like I can't eat the food in the hotels because I don't know who's been preparing it. I don't know if kind of Boris has joined the staff recently and is kind of, dealing with the condiments and stuff like that. So I have to be a bit more careful with that kind of thing. But yeah, it's just kind of been a constant escalation. But other ways they react is like when we first, I mentioned before with the Skripal case, we got those domestic passport files, and we discovered that they belong to a very small range of passport numbers. So we decided that we would get the other passport files for that range of numbers. And when we got them, and this was a few weeks after we'd done the original investigation, all the photographs had been removed from them.
Hmm.
And obviously this was, the Russian authorities trying to get rid of those photos, but then we just published that they were clearly trying to cover up what they were doing. So then we got more of these files for another case related to the FSB, and they had actually, rather than removing the photographs, they had swapped the photographs. And we figured that out when we discovered that a man had the photograph of a woman on his passport file. So they were clearly taking activities there to stop us from doing what we were doing. And then also we had the kind of Duma passing a law to prevent Russian soldiers from using stuff from on their social media profiles. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely been steps taken to stop us from doing our work, both kind of in kind of direct disinformation campaigns against us and this other form. I mean, recently we've actually just had a court case against Riafan, the Russian kind of troll factory run by Prigozhin, where his Riafan faked direct messages from one of my colleagues, and we're waiting for the results of that case, which should come out any day, but I'm pretty sure we've won that one. But yeah, we've done them from defamation for that case, so that'll be a fun one when the results come out.
Wow. Well, obviously you've taken on quite a great deal of personal risk and challenge in addition to the profile on these issues, and really helped educate, I think, the world, not just with the particular investigations you've done, but with a methodology and a sense of our educational need, which I think is very valuable for all of us in terms of navigating this technology future and ensuring appropriate transparency. Let me put one more question to you. I think, and Joshua Kaminsky submitted, I think, a good kind of closing question for you, which is his assessment is that your book is more optimistic than pessimistic about the future of technology. And we've had several speakers here in our series that have written books that elucidate the dangers and the dark sides of technologies as they're developing and where they're going in the future. Can you talk a little just about your take on the future of tech and transparency and where you think this is heading? We've talked a little bit today about some of the challenges, but where do you perceive the trajectory that we're on in terms of news and related technology? I think you may be muted, Eliot.
Apologies.
There you go.
Yeah, I think it comes down to really not kind of just lying back and thinking everything's going to be okay with democracy, because it's really not. I think the events of January 6th shows what happens, when you not only kind of ignore these groups, but, as, political parties and kind of politically focused media has done, is engage with basically conspiracy theories to basically serve power rather than truth. And that's incredibly dangerous. But this is happening in other places in the world. It's not just something that's uniquely American. And I think we need to be more proactive about the way in which we kind of engage. I've mentioned earlier the ways I think that we can do that. And I think if we don't do that, then we're just setting ourselves up as democratic societies to fail, because we'll never really engage people again in the way that we have done in the past. And I think in many senses, because of what's happened over the last 10 years with kind of the rise of the internet and the way that everyone's kind of engaging in a new way, that the traditional kind of sources of power and authority that aren't adapting to those changes will find themselves increasingly isolated from groups that form online that are looking for alternatives. And if those alternatives are conspiracy theories, then that's going to be incredibly damaging for society. And I think there is a way forward. I think there is a solution to that. I mean, we've proven with Bellingcat the power of people working together, and we've achieved a lot. We've brought justice to kind of people who've been kind of betrayed. We've highlighted issues that otherwise wouldn't have been discovered. And we're a tiny organization, with 20 staff members with some volunteers. And if that's something that can be kind of scaled up, not just to 20 people, to 20,000 people across the world, then I think we'd be in a much better place. So, it's not 100% optimistic, but it's better than not doing anything and just hoping for the best.
Yeah, well, thank you for your active approach on this, and we appreciate your investigative work, and encourage folks to take a look at We Are Bellingcat: Global Crime, Online Sleuths, and the Bold Future of News. Sounds like it's a really important book. Thank you, Eliot Higgins, for sharing your time with and your thoughts about this with us today. We really appreciate you being with us, and I want to say thank you to our attendees as well. And hope everybody stays well, and we'll see you soon.